The space station, Orbital Station Zeta-6, was a marvel of human engineering, an isolated outpost far beyond the reach of Earth. Inside its metal walls, a small group of scientists, engineers, and researchers worked together to push the boundaries of science. Among the most exciting projects being developed was the creation of bio-dragons, genetically engineered creatures designed to withstand the harsh conditions of space travel. These dragons, though born in labs rather than ancient caves, were a marvel. Their scales shimmered with an otherworldly glow, and their massive wings, still growing, were meant to allow them to traverse both the endless void of space and the dangerous surfaces of alien planets. The hatchlings, only a few weeks old, were the pride of the station. They had been carefully raised by the scientists and geneticists who had worked tirelessly to create them. The team had grown fond of the creatures who, despite their massive potential, were still innocent and curious. These hatchlings weren't dangerous, not yet anyway. They were too young to show any sign of the power their fully grown forms would one day possess. But one morning, something strange happened. The hatchlings were gone. It was Dr. Hannah Blake, the lead scientist on the Bio-Dragon project, who first noticed. She entered the large glass-walled enclosure where the hatchlings had been kept, only to find it empty. The bedding was disturbed and the food bowls had been left untouched. The large glowing dragon eggs that had once been home to the hatchlings were now cold, their warmth and energy completely drained. A wave of panic hit her chest, but she remained calm. It didn't make sense. She checked the security feeds. They showed the usual images of quiet corridors and the occasional researcher walking by. But the hatchlings were nowhere to be found. Not a single figure, not a single movement. Where did they go? Hannah whispered to herself, staring at the screen. There was no sign of a break-in, no sign of tampering with the doors or the security system. No alarms had sounded. It was as if the hatchlings had simply disappeared. Hannah called for help immediately. The other scientists arrived in a rush, all of them equally shocked. Some suggested that the hatchlings might have escaped through a hidden vent or tunnel, but that seemed impossible. The enclosure was tightly secured. The area had been checked multiple times. And yet the hatchlings were gone. "Are you sure the cameras are working properly?" Dr. Alan Russo asked, his voice tinged with concern. He was the station's chief engineer, responsible for maintaining the entire facility's systems, including the security feeds. "They are," Hannah said, a little impatient. "There's no sign of them anywhere." Panic quickly spread throughout the station. The hatchlings had been under constant supervision, and now they were nowhere to be found. The disappearance made no sense. The idea that they had simply vanished into thin air seemed too bizarre to even consider. Everyone began to ask the same question. How could they have gotten out? More importantly, where were they now? The station's security team was brought in, combing through every inch of the facility. They checked the docking bays, the airlocks, the ventilation systems, and even the external hull. But there was nothing. The hatchlings were simply gone. Leon Carter, the station's mechanic, was busy working in the lower levels of the station when he heard the news. He had been repairing a malfunctioning shuttle, his greasy hands covered in oil and grime. He didn't think much of the hatchlings' disappearance at first. After all, they were just part of a research project, right? But as the news spread, the gravity of the situation became clear. These weren't just any creatures. They were bioengineered beings, a marvel of modern science. The entire project depended on their success. If the hatchlings had been taken, or worse, lost, it could spell disaster for the entire station. Leon wasn't a scientist. He was just a mechanic, someone who made sure the machines worked. But he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease among the crew. The station's leadership was furious. The researchers were desperate, and the scientists were frantic. The hatchlings weren't just important to the station. They were a symbol of the future of space exploration. And now they were gone. For days the search continued. Every corridor, every maintenance tunnel, every room was scoured by the station's security team. Nothing. The hatchlings were nowhere to be found. There were no signs of any disturbance in the systems, no hidden doors, no secret passageways. It was as if they had simply vanished. The station's researchers were at a loss. Dr. Blake, in particular, had become obsessed with the disappearance. She spent every waking hour searching, analyzing every possible explanation, but nothing made sense. The hatchlings had been in their enclosure one moment, and the next they were gone. "There's something we're missing," Hannah said one day, staring at a map of the station's layout. "We've searched everywhere. They can't just vanish. There has to be a reason." But no one could figure out what that reason was. Weeks passed and the tension only grew. The scientists had no answers and the rest of the crew were on edge. Hespera, the dragon mother, was becoming increasingly agitated. She paced the enclosure, her eyes wild with confusion and fear. The other crew members tried to comfort her, but it was clear that she was in distress. She wanted her hatchlings back. Leon Carter, meanwhile, continued his work, quietly keeping to himself in the lower levels of the station. He had always kept a distance from the drama of the upper floors. He was a simple man with a simple job, and he didn't involve himself in the complicated research that went on at the heart of the station. But something about the hatchling's disappearance was gnawing at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that the answers were closer than anyone realized. It wasn't until late one evening that he heard it. A faint noise, almost like a whisper echoing through the walls. Leon wasn't one to get spooked easily, but something about the sound made his skin crawl. He wasn't sure why, but he felt drawn to investigate. Without thinking, he grabbed a flashlight and made his way down into the deepest maintenance tunnel. It was cold and quiet, the air thick with the smell of metal and grease, and then in the shadows he saw something that stopped him dead in his tracks. A small, glowing shape. He squinted, unsure if he was seeing things, but as he stepped closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was one of the hatchlings. The creature was curled up, resting peacefully against a pile of old tools, its shimmering scales catching the dim light. Leon's mouth went dry. How had it gotten here, and where were the others? But before he could answer those questions, something even stranger happened. The hatchling stirred. The space station buzzed with activity, its corridors filled with hurried footsteps and worried voices. Security teams combed through every inch of the station, conducting sweeps, checking every vent, every maintenance shaft, and every possible hiding place. The hatchlings had been missing for over a week, and still there was no sign of them. It seemed like the station was hiding them, as if the walls themselves had swallowed them whole. Dr. Hannah Blake, the lead scientist on the Bio-Dragon project, was growing desperate. She sat in her small office, her fingers running over the edge of a map of the station. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep. She had barely eaten since the hatchlings disappeared. Every moment felt like an eternity, and the pressure from the higher-ups was mounting. "Hannah, there's got to be something we're missing," said Dr. Alan Russo, the chief engineer, who had walked into her office without knocking. He was holding a tablet in his hand, showing the most recent security footage. "We've checked the ventilation systems, the storage rooms, and even the external hall. There's no trace of them." "I know," Hannah replied, her voice thick with frustration. She ran a hand through her messy hair, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "But I can't shake the feeling that we're looking in all the wrong places. They didn't just vanish. Someone or something must have taken them." Alan sat down beside her, his face grim. "If it was sabotage, we would have found something by now. The security scans would have detected any unauthorized access." Hannah nodded but remained silent. She wasn't so sure. She had seen the hatchlings grow under her care, and something about their behavior had always felt different. They were more aware, more intelligent than any animal she had ever encountered. Had they somehow left on their own? Or had something or someone been influencing them? The thought of sabotage haunted her. She had trusted everyone on the station, but there was always the possibility that someone was hiding something. Maybe they had taken the hatchlings for a reason. But who could it be and why? As the days dragged on, the atmosphere on the station grew tense. The scientists and engineers worked around the clock, their faces drawn and tired, but no answer seemed to emerge. Crew members whispered to each other in the halls, casting nervous glances at the empty enclosures. Hespera, the mother dragon, had become increasingly agitated. Her growls echoed through the station and her eyes were wild with confusion. The researchers tried to calm her, but nothing seemed to help. Leon Carter, the station mechanic, had been avoiding the chaos above. He preferred the quiet of the lower levels, where he could lose himself in his work. There was something about the whole situation that didn't sit right with him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He had never been part of the scientific community on the station, never gotten involved with the projects or the fancy experiments. He was just a mechanic, one of the many who kept the systems running smoothly. But something about the disappearance of the hatchlings tugged at him. It didn't make sense. Why had they disappeared? And why was it so hard to find them? One evening, after finishing a routine inspection of the docking bay, Leon found himself in one of the station's quieter corridors. The sounds of footsteps and voices had faded away, leaving a strange, eerie silence in the air. As he walked through the dimly lit hall, something caught his eye. A faint shimmer of light, almost like a glow, seemed to be coming from a door that had been left ajar. Curious, Leon approached the door slowly, his boots making soft thuds against the metal floor. The room was a maintenance storage area, nothing unusual there, but the glowing light was strange. He stepped inside and followed the light, which seemed to come from beneath a pile of discarded parts. When he bent down to investigate, his heart skipped a beat. There, nestled among the forgotten tools and equipment, was one of the missing hatchlings. It was curled up in a corner, its shimmering scales catching the faint light from above. The little creature was sleeping soundly, as if it had been there for hours or even days. Leon took a step closer, unsure of what to do. The hatchling didn't react. It didn't even stir when he crouched down beside it. Slowly, Leon reached out and gently touched the creature's warm scales. It was real. It was the same hatchling that had been missing for so long. But where were the others? Leon quickly stood up and looked around the room, his eyes scanning for any sign of the other hatchlings. He didn't know why, but something inside him urged him to look deeper. He couldn't explain it, but he felt connected to the creatures. As a mechanic, he had always been good with machines, but this was different. There was something about the hatchlings that made him feel responsible for them. After a few minutes, Leon found nothing. The hatchling was the only one there. He stood for a moment, his mind racing. How had it gotten here? Why was it alone? And why hadn't the security system caught any sign of it being moved? He knew he couldn't keep the hatchling there in the storage room hidden away. But he also knew he couldn't take it back to the research lab. If anyone found out, they would surely want to investigate. And the hatchling's disappearance would become even more of a mystery. Instead, Leon carefully scooped up the hatchling, cradling it gently in his arms. The creature's body was surprisingly warm against his chest, and for a moment he simply stood there holding it. It felt right, like the hatchling trusted him. He wasn't sure why he felt that way, but the bond between them was undeniable. As he turned to leave the room, a noise behind him made him freeze. A soft, muffled sound echoed from the hallway, a distant thud. Leon glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. He had the distinct feeling that someone was watching him. Quickly, he moved toward the exit, his heart racing. He couldn't explain it, but he knew one thing for sure. There was more to this than anyone was letting on. The hatchlings hadn't just disappeared. They had been hidden, and they weren't the only ones with secrets. Leon's footsteps quickened as he made his way back to his small, quiet workshop. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something bigger was happening on the station, something that was far from over. And the hatchlings, he realized, were at the heart of it all. The next few days felt strange for Leon Carter. He couldn't stop thinking about the hatchling he had found in the maintenance storage room. He had kept it hidden in his workshop, away from the eyes of the crew and scientists. The little dragon, still young and vulnerable, had curled up on a pile of old parts and fallen into a deep sleep. It seemed completely calm, almost like it knew it was safe with him. Leon wasn't sure why, but he felt a strong sense of responsibility for the hatchling. It wasn't like he was some expert on dragons or even animals for that matter. He was a mechanic, a simple man who worked with machines. But something about this creature, this tiny dragon, made him feel connected to it. It felt like the hatchling had trusted him, and that trust had made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, a deep sense of purpose. But Leon knew he couldn't keep it hidden forever. He couldn't keep ignoring the strange feelings that had started to bubble inside him. He had to find out what was going on. Why had the hatchling been separated from its siblings? Why was it hiding in his workshop? And most importantly, why did it seem to be drawn to him? The station, meanwhile, was growing more tense by the day. The search for the hatchlings continued, but there were still no answers. Crew members were on edge, some even growing suspicious of each other. Rumors spread. Some whispered that the hatchlings had been taken by an outsider, a thief who knew how valuable they were. Others believed that the dragons had somehow escaped on their own and were hiding somewhere in the station. As the days turned into weeks, The once bustling corridors of the station felt colder, quieter. Even the station's leadership seemed uncertain, their meetings filled with frustrated voices and unanswered questions. The scientists and engineers were working nonstop, but despite their best efforts, they had made no progress in finding the missing hatchlings. Leon knew that if he didn't do something soon, the truth would remain hidden. So one night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, he decided to investigate further. The hatchling in his workshop was still asleep when he gently lifted it from its resting spot. It didn't wake, only curled tighter into his arms, its tiny body warm and soft. Leon carefully carried it through the dimly lit corridors, making sure to avoid any security cameras. He had no idea what he was doing, but the sense of urgency had grown too strong to ignore. He made his way down to the old storage area where he had found the hatchling. It was a part of the station that hadn't been used in years, a maze of forgotten rooms and equipment that no one ever bothered to maintain. Leon had always liked the quiet of the lower levels, the hum of the station's machinery, the low whir of the ventilation system. It all seemed so distant from the chaos of the upper levels. When he reached the storage room, Leon hesitated for a moment before entering. The door creaked as he pushed it open and he stepped inside, scanning the room for anything unusual. The glow of his flashlight cast long shadows across the cluttered floor. There in the corner was the pile of old tools where he had found the hatchling days ago. The spot seemed untouched. Nothing had moved, but something was different now. There, just barely visible behind a stack of discarded crates, was a small, glimmering object. Leon felt his heart race. He stepped closer, his flashlight shining on the object, and saw that it was a small metallic disc, shiny, smooth, and unlike anything he had ever seen before. It was no bigger than a coin, but the way it glowed in the dim light sent a chill down his spine. Leon bent down to pick it up, his fingers brushing against the cool surface. The moment his hand touched the disc, a strange sensation washed over him. A faint hum filled the air, almost like a pulse. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make his heart skip a beat. The hatchling in his arms stirred at the sound, its eyes blinking open for the first time since Leon had found it. It made a small, soft noise like a contented purr, and pressed its tiny head against Leon's chest. The feeling inside him grew stronger. This was no ordinary object. Leon had no idea what it was, but it was clearly important, and somehow he felt like he had been meant to find it. He stood up and examined the disc more closely. There were intricate symbols etched into its surface, symbols he couldn't recognize. It almost looked like some kind of ancient technology, far beyond anything the station had. It seemed to pulse with energy, like it was alive. Leon's mind raced. Was this the reason the hatchling had been hiding? Had the dragon somehow been connected to this strange object? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Leon froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He quickly slipped the disc into his pocket and glanced around. The hatchling, sensing the danger, curled up against him again, its body stiff with alertness. He had to get out of there fast. Leon turned and hurried back down the hallway, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. He had no idea who was coming, but he knew it was only a matter of time before someone found out what he had discovered. The hatchling in his arms seemed to sense his urgency, its tiny claws digging into his shirt as if urging him to hurry. When he reached his workshop, Leon quickly locked the door behind him and placed the hatchling on his workbench. He stood there for a moment, trying to catch his breath, but the weight of what had just happened was heavy on his mind. The disc, whatever it was, seemed to be the key to everything. The hatchling looked up at him with wide, intelligent eyes. It was almost as if it knew something Leon didn't. The way it gazed at him, unblinking, made him feel as though it were waiting for him to make the next move. He ran a hand through his hair, thinking furiously. What had the disc meant? Why had the hatchling been drawn to it? And why did he feel like he had a part to play in whatever was happening? There was no time to waste. He couldn't just sit on this discovery. He had to find out what it meant, and he had to do it fast, before anyone else figured out what was going on. But as he looked at the hatchling once more, he realized there was something else he needed to do first. Something that couldn't wait. He needed to protect the hatchling, and to do that he needed answers. And he needed them now. The next few days felt like a blur to Leon Carter. He kept the disc hidden in his workshop, never letting anyone see it. It pulsed softly in his pocket, its strange energy making him uneasy yet strangely drawn to it at the same time. Every time he looked at the hatchling, now resting peacefully on the workbench, he felt a stronger bond between them. It was as if the creature was aware of something he didn't understand. Its intelligent, knowing eyes often watched him with a quiet intensity, and sometimes, Leon swore he could hear the faintest hum coming from the hatchling when it was close to the disk. Leon couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery was bigger than him, bigger than the station, and bigger than the Bio-Dragon project itself. He had to know more about the disk and what role it played in the hatchling's disappearance. But there was one problem. He didn't have the expertise to understand what he had found. So Leon made a decision. He would go to the one person who might be able to help him, someone he had never fully trusted but who knew the station's systems better than anyone. Dr. Alan Russo, the station's chief engineer, was a man of few words, but his knowledge of technology was unmatched. He had worked on some of the most advanced systems on the station, and Leon had always admired his skill. But there was something about Alan that unsettled him. The man had a cold, calculating way of looking at the world, as if everything was a puzzle to be solved, regardless of the consequences. Leon had never worked closely with Alan, but he knew that if anyone could make sense of the disk, it was him. So one evening after hours, Leon slipped into Alan's lab. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and Leon stepped inside, trying to remain as quiet as possible. Alan was hunched over a console, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. When he heard Leon enter, he didn't look up right away. Instead, he continued typing, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Leon cleared his throat. "Dr. Russo," he said quietly. Alan didn't look up. "You know, Leon, when you enter a room, you don't have to sneak around like you're about to steal something. What is it you need?" Leon hesitated for a moment, then pulled the small disk from his pocket. He placed it carefully on the desk between them. Alan finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the object. "What's this?" Alan asked, his voice low, tinged with both curiosity and caution. "I found it," Leon said. "In the storage room where I found one of the hatchlings. It's been giving off this strange energy. It's unlike anything I've seen before." Alan reached forward and picked up the disk, turning it over in his hands. He studied it closely, his brow furrowed. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to hold a strange, almost hypnotic power. Alan's fingers traced the edges of the disk as he muttered to himself. "This doesn't make any sense," Alan said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is ancient technology. No, this is more than just ancient. This is something completely different." Leon's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, different?" Alan's eyes met Leon's, and for the first time there was a flicker of genuine interest in his gaze. "This technology doesn't belong to us. It's older than anything we've ever come across. It's not just technology. It's a kind of living energy. It's bioorganic, and the way it reacts to the hatchling, it's like it's been waiting for this moment." Leon's mind raced. But why would the hatchling be connected to it? Why was it hiding in the storage room? Alan looked at the hatchling, who was now awake, its small eyes gleaming with an unsettling wisdom. "That's what I need to figure out. This disk is part of something much larger, something that ties into the Bio-Dragon project in a way we never anticipated. The hatchlings weren't just created to be living tools for space travel. They were created to unlock something." Leon's confusion deepened. "Unlock what?" Alan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sat back in his chair, still holding the disk. "I don't know yet, but we're about to find out. Whatever this is, it's connected to the dragons in a way we didn't understand before. They've been bred to interact with this kind of energy. This disk is the key to something much bigger than all of us." Leon's mind buzzed with questions, but before he could ask another one, the lights in the lab flickered. A soft hum filled the air, and Alan's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Something's wrong," Alan muttered. "I can feel it." The door to the lab slid open with a sudden rush of air, and several security officers entered, their faces stern and serious. Leon's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to remain calm. "Dr. Russo," one of the officers said, "we need to speak with you immediately. There's been an incident." Alan stood up quickly, his eyes flicking between the security officers and Leon. "What kind of incident?" "There's been a breach," the officer replied, glancing at Leon with a look of suspicion. "We believe someone has been tampering with the Bio-Dragon project. We need to search the facility." Leon's stomach dropped. He knew what this meant. The security officers had already begun their search for the missing hatchlings, and now they were looking for answers. If they found out that Leon had the disc, they would have no choice but to investigate. The truth was about to come to light. Alan, sensing the danger, quickly glanced at Leon. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice low and urgent. Before Leon could respond, the officer turned to him. "You're coming with us. We need to ask you a few questions." Alan stepped forward, blocking the officer's path. "What are you talking about?" "Leon hasn't done anything." The officer's eyes narrowed. "That's for us to determine." As they moved to escort Leon out of the lab, something strange happened. The hatchling, still sitting on the workbench, suddenly emitted a low hum. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, vibrating the air around it. The disc in Alan's hand began to glow, and the energy in the room seemed to shift. Like a wave of power washing over them, the officers froze, staring at the glowing disc and the hatchling, their faces filled with confusion and fear. "Do you feel that?" Alan whispered, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the lab's door slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing them inside. The room was silent, save for the low hum of the hatchling, which had grown louder and more insistent as it pulsed in rhythm with the strange disc. The air around them felt heavy, charged with energy, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Leon's heart raced. Something was happening. Something big. The officers and Alan stood frozen, staring at the glowing disc and the hatchling, both of which seemed to have a power they couldn't understand. "Alan, what's going on?" Leon whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum. Alan didn't answer at first. He was too busy staring at the glowing disc, his eyes wide with disbelief. The hatchling, sitting calmly on the workbench, was staring at the disc, its gaze intense, as if it were waiting for something to happen. I don't know," Alan finally said, his voice tight with a mix of awe and fear. This is unlike anything I've ever seen before. The disc, it's alive in a way I didn't expect. And the hatchling?" His voice trailed off as he turned his eyes to Leon. "I think the hatchlings were never just meant to be laborers or companions. They were created for something much more significant." The officers looked at each other, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. "What are you talking about?" one of them asked, his voice wary. "What's happening here?" Alan took a deep breath. "The hatchlings are connected to the disc. They weren't just genetically engineered for physical tasks. They were designed to interact with this ancient technology. The energy it radiates, it's meant to awaken something that's been dormant for years. These creatures were never just pets or workers. They are the key to unlocking that power." Leon's mind raced. "But why didn't we know about this? Why wasn't any of this part of the original project?" Alan's eyes flickered with a mix of guilt and realization. "Because no one knew. Not even the people who originally designed the Biodragon project. They thought they were creating a tool, a creature that could survive in extreme environments. But they missed something crucial. The dragons weren't just meant to help us explore the stars. They were meant to activate a hidden force. The disc is part of that force, and the hatchlings are the catalyst." The realization hit Leon like a punch to the stomach. The hatchlings, the glowing disc, the mysterious connection, everything was part of a much larger plan. But why? And who had put this plan into motion? Suddenly, the door to the lab opened again, and several more security officers rushed inside. They were carrying equipment, scanning the room for signs of tampering. Their leader, a tall woman with sharp features, stepped forward and immediately took in the scene. The glowing disc, the hatchling on the workbench, and the stunned faces of Leon and Alan. "What's going on here?" the officer demanded, her voice hard. "What are you hiding?" Before anyone could respond, the hatchling gave a loud, almost musical sound, a noise that seemed to vibrate through the room. The disc flared brightly and the air seemed to thicken. Leon felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as the entire room shifted with energy. "This is it," Alan said under his breath, his eyes locked on the hatchling. "This is what the Biodragon project was always meant to find. We were wrong to think we were in control. This thing, this energy, it's alive and it's been waiting for us to activate it. The hatchlings were always going to lead us here." The officer stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. "What does it mean? What's happening?" Leon looked at Alan, his face pale. "If what you're saying is true, then we've been part of something much bigger than any of us realized. These hatchlings were never meant to be pets. They were meant to unlock something ancient, something that could change everything. Alan nodded grimly. We've been too focused on the wrong things. We were looking at the dragons as tools, not realizing that they were part of a larger plan. The disk, the hatchlings, they're connected to an ancient technology that has been dormant for centuries. It's a force we can barely comprehend, and now it's waking up. Leon's heart pounded in his chest. And what happens when it wakes up? Alan's face darkened. That's what we need to find out. The truth is, I don't think we can control it. We've triggered something that can't be undone. The hatchlings, this disk, it's all part of something much older, and it's too late to stop it now. Leon took a step back, trying to process everything. His mind was racing, his thoughts spinning. He had always known something was off about the hatchlings, but he never imagined this. An ancient power. A force hidden within the dragons waiting to be unlocked. Then what do we do now? Leon asked, his voice shaking. Alan turned to face him, his expression grave. Now, we have to make sure we don't let it destroy everything we've built. We need to figure out how to control this energy before it's too late. The hatchlings have been guiding us, but we need to understand what happens next. The officer who had entered with the others took a step forward, her face hard. Are you saying this is all a mistake? That we've been playing with forces we can't understand? Alan looked at her directly. No, it's not a mistake. It's the purpose of the project. The dragons were never just animals. They were the key to unlocking an ancient force, one that's beyond our control. We've been part of a plan all along, but the plan was never about creating tools for space exploration. It was about awakening this power. The room fell into silence as everyone processed the enormity of what was happening. The hatchling, still perched on the workbench, let out another soft hum. The disc in Alan's hand vibrated again, its glow pulsing in sync with the hatchling's sound. Leon couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than they had imagined. We need to move quickly, Alan said, his voice low. The longer we wait, the more unpredictable this will become. The hatchlings are the only ones who can guide us, but we need to figure out how to harness this power before it takes control of us. Leon nodded, his mind made up. He wasn't sure what was coming, but one thing was clear. The hatchlings had been meant for something far greater than anyone had realized. And now it was up to him to help unlock their true potential. As he turned to face the officers, he knew the truth. The hatchlings hadn't just disappeared. They had been hiding, waiting until the moment was right. And now that moment had come. The station, the Biodragon project, and everything they had worked for. It was all part of something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. And the key to everything lay in the mysterious, glowing disk and the hatchlings who had always been meant to lead them there. But the real question was, what would happen when the ancient power was fully awakened?